Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoff. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. And a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon for your contributions to my channel. This video is going to be all about cranial nerve 9, or the glossopharyngeal nerve. So let's get into it. We'll first start by talking about the origin of the glossopharyngeal nerve here at the brainstem, and then we'll go into all the branches and all the functions. Alright, so right here we're looking at the midline of the neck and the brainstem. So right here, this is one half of the medulla oblongata. Okay, and then down here would of course be the cervical spinal cord. Now, I have here a couple of cranial nerves that you can see originating from the medulla. This one right here, if we follow it, this one is the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. And then this one above it, this is cranial nerve 9. This is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now, if we look at the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves, both of them originate from the medulla of the brainstem, and they loop around here and exit the cranial cavity through this space called the jugular foramen. And you can see the glossopharyngeal nerve exiting right there. Now, from the origin here at the medulla, you can see several roots that I've drawn from the medulla that are coming together to form the entire nerve, glossopharyngeal. You could think of each of these nerves as coming from a separate nucleus within the medulla oblongata. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll foreshadow this. Within the medulla, there's a bunch of nuclei right here. For example, this one on top is the inferior salivatory nucleus. We've got the spinal nucleus of cranial nerve 5, the nucleus ambiguus, the solitary nucleus right here. And so to form the entire glossopharyngeal nerve, each of these nuclei is going to have contributions. So you might get some roots from the solitary nucleus, some roots from the nucleus ambiguus, and so on and so forth. And that's what these little roots are meant to show. And so they kind of combine into one glossopharyngeal nerve that will exit through the jugular foramen. Now, why do I mention this? Well, I'm going to jump way ahead to what will actually be the end of this video, and by the end of it, this will actually make more sense to you, hopefully, and we'll learn all this. But when I draw these various nerve components coming off of each of these nuclei, for the sake of simplicity, I drew them separately, so it looks like there's 4 separate ones here. But in reality, once those roots come off of the medulla, they sort of form one whole nerve. And so they don't really run separately like this until we start getting all these branches more distally. But before they exit this jugular foramen, they really exist as one complete glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay? But in any case, the glossopharyngeal nerve here is going to exit the cranium via the jugular foramen with a number of other structures, including the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, the spinal accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, and also the internal jugular vein. The hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12, does not exit via the jugular foramen. It actually exits via the hypoglossal canal, which is actually nearby, but we'll cover that in a few videos. All right, let's take a look at this picture right here. It's the same thing from before, except everything's been shifted over to the right. So we have our medulla oblongata here in gold, and we have the 4 nuclei that are relevant for us here. Here's our jugular foramen. This is where the glossopharyngeal nerve will exit, and these 2 structures down here I will explain in just a minute. We're going to begin by looking at SN, which is the solitary nucleus. So down here is the tongue. Now when we think about the tongue, there's really 2 types of sensation that we have to consider. One is general sensation. This is like if you were to touch your tongue with your finger, or if you touch your leg, the same thing as you touch your arm, general somatosensation. But there's also the special sense of taste. That's what we're considering here, taste. General sensation we will look at the end of the video, but this is taste. And when we consider taste, the tongue has split innervation. The anterior 2/3 of the tongue, that taste is relayed back to the medulla via the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7. So what we're considering here is the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, right in this area. The posterior 1/3 of the tongue, taste is relayed back to the medulla via this glossopharyngeal nerve. And also, any taste sensation from taste buds located in the valate, also called circumvallate papillae, and fungiform papillae, that taste sensation is relayed also via the glossopharyngeal nerve. And for those taste buds that are located in the valate or fungiform papillae, it doesn't matter where on the tongue it is, if it's posterior or anterior, okay? Now, you can view the glossopharyngeal nerve in one of two ways. You could consider its afferent part, which is going from the periphery back up into the brainstem, or for some of these, you can consider the motor part from the brainstem back out into the periphery. You have here two enlargements right after the glossopharyngeal nerve exits the jugular foramen called the superior ganglion and the inferior ganglion. Okay? Now this is where it's important to remember that all of these parts right here initially are all together as one glossopharyngeal nerve. We'll take a look here at this picture. So right here, now we have the glossopharyngeal nerve. Very quickly though, after it exits the jugular foramen, it gets this enlargement called the superior ganglion. Now you have to be very careful with this naming because there's also a superior ganglion associated with the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. So to be rigorous, we would say the superior ganglion of cranial nerve 9 versus 10. Then we get more descent here, and another enlargement that's bigger than the superior ganglion. This one is the inferior ganglion. A similar problem. There's also an inferior ganglion for the vagus nerve, so we need to be specific there too. For this video though, when I say superior and inferior ganglion, I'm referring to the glossopharyngeal nerve. But if you're talking about this very generally, you need to make sure you specify which cranial nerve you're talking about. So if you're looking at this from an afferent perspective, all of them pass to the inferior ganglion and then to the superior ganglion and then to the medulla. If you're looking at the efferent perspective, they're all going through the superior ganglion down to the inferior ganglion, and then you get all of these branches. Okay? So that's what I'm trying to show here. So they're all going to go through that superior ganglion, and then that inferior ganglion, which is also called the petrous ganglion. Let's now look at the pathway for the nucleus ambiguus, and this one is actually probably the easiest by far of all of these. So this one is purely motor, or efferent. If we look at its output, nerves come out here as part of the glossopharyngeal nerve, out of the jugular foramen, down to the superior and inferior ganglia. And then the nice thing here for this output is the nerves go down and just do one thing. They innervate this muscle, which is called the stylopharyngeus. Just to take a brief aside here, stylopharyngeus, as you might imagine, its origin is the styloid process, in particular the medial aspect of the styloid process, has a few insertions, the lateral glossoepiglottic fold, the thyroid cartilage, that is its posterior aspect. Some of them are on the pharynx, like the pharyngeal constrictors, and so when this muscle contracts and pulls these structures up towards the styloid process, that results in elevation of the pharynx and the larynx. That's important during swallowing. If you put your fingers on your throat and you actively swallow, you'll actually feel those structures moving up, and this is one of the muscles that actually helps accomplish that. And so we say the stylopharyngeus muscle is innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve, but ultimately that output comes from the nucleus ambiguus component of the medulla. The next pathway we're going to look at is one that's originating from the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Now I know what you're thinking, trigeminal nerve, isn't that associated with the pons? Well, if you go back and look at the trigeminal pathway that we covered in previous videos, you'll remember that the trigeminal ganglion is associated with the pons. And those afferent nerves that are associated with the trigeminal nerve enter the trigeminal ganglion, and then they do enter the pons. However, they immediately descend down towards the medulla, and they synapse with second-order neurons in the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So sometimes it's just called the spinal nucleus because we do have other cranial nerves associated with it clearly, but this is in the medulla, even though it's named for the trigeminal nerve. Okay? So if we go down here near the ear, in particular the outer and middle ear, there's certain regions that are actually having sensory innervation provided by the spinal nucleus here. So if we look, here's the outermost part of the ear, and in particular the rim of the auricle, or the pinna, that gets sensory innervation from the spinal nucleus. If we look at the external acoustic meatus, your ear hole, and then the walls of the auditory canal, those are innervated this way. Here's your tympanic cavity. This is just a representation of it. You have the inferior boundary, the superior. This would actually be the lateral boundary where you have the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. This would be the medial boundary, right? And then down here you have the eustachian tube, or the pharyngotympanic tube as it's often called. This actually receives sensory innervation this way. And then inside the tympanic cavity, and in particular the inner surface of the tympanic membrane, not the outer surface, but the inner surface of the tympanic membrane, all of these structures have sensory innervation provided by nerves coming from that spinal nucleus. Okay? So we can follow those back, and going in this direction, they pass through the inferior and superior ganglia, go up through the jugular foramen, and notice there's another branch here before it gets back to the spinal nucleus. And this branch actually, depending on how you're viewing it, actually converges with the main part of this prior to the exit through the jugular foramen. And so this actually provides some sensory innervation of some of the dura mater that's in here on the surface of bone within the cranium. And so that sensory information is also relayed back to the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. And so obviously this would be general sensation as opposed to what we talked about in the tongue a few minutes ago. This was special sensation. So this is general somatosensation. The next pathway is a motor pathway that is fairly complicated, and it originates from this nucleus right here in the medulla called the inferior salivatory nucleus. So we have efferent motor fibers that come out of the inferior salivatory nucleus. They exit the cranium via the jugular foramen, pass through the superior and inferior ganglia right there, right? And they ultimately go to the tympanic cavity right here. Now this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So we have to zoom in on everything. So right here's the ear, of course. This is your auditory canal, right? And then this cube represents the tympanic cavity and each of the 6 walls of it. Now, technically, this is not the correct orientation relative to the auditory canal right here, but just so we understand, for the purposes of the picture, this red square or red wall in the back, this is going to be the medial wall, and this blue square closest to the viewer, this is going to be the lateral wall. Now these blue nerve fibers right here are the same nerve fibers that we saw on the previous slide that are headed towards the tympanic cavity. And they're going to enter the tympanic cavity through this hole in the inferior wall. And this hole is called the tympanic canaliculus. And so this branch, which is specifically called the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve, moves through the tympanic canaliculus into the tympanic cavity, and then it goes to innervate a structure here on the medial wall called the promontory, or the tympanic promontory. Now, the tympanic promontory is a site for the tympanic plexus. Okay? Now, the tympanic plexus has both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. The parasympathetic innervation comes from this tympanic branch. So the sympathetic innervation must come from another source, and it comes from the carotid plexus. We're not going into the sympathetic nervous system here in a lot of detail. That's for other videos. But it suffices to say there are efferent nerve fibers from the superior cervical ganglion that ultimately form something called the carotid plexus. And then branches of that then go to the tympanic promontory. And so the tympanic promontory therefore has a tympanic plexus with sympathetic fibers from the carotid plexus and then parasympathetic fibers from this tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now from this tympanic plexus, there's a nerve that comes off of it, and it's called the lesser petrosal nerve. Now, above these 2 circles right here, this is meant to be the cranium up here, or the cranial cavity, okay? Below it is outside the cranial cavity. For obvious reasons, I didn't draw the skull in. Now this lesser petrosal nerve that comes off of the tympanic plexus is actually going to enter the cranial cavity through this little hole here called the hiatus of the lesser petrosal nerve. And now it's inside the cranial cavity. Well, it's actually going to loop back out, which seems kind of redundant, but it does. And the hole that it loops out of the cranial cavity from is called the foramen ovale. Now, you might have seen the term foramen ovale before, and that's because it's actually the site of exit of the mandibular nerve the V3 branch of the trigeminal nerve. So remember, we've got the trigeminal ganglion. We've got V1, the ophthalmic nerve, on top. V2 in the middle is the maxillary nerve. Both of those are purely sensory. And then we have this mixed nerve, which is V3, the mandibular nerve, and it's going to exit the cranium ultimately through this foramen ovale. So it exits that and then goes to a variety of mastication muscles, or if it's the sensory component, just to the mandibular region in general. But this lesser petrosal nerve also exits the cranium through the foramen ovale. Okay, so it exits, and it goes to a structure called the otic ganglion. Now up here, this isn't too terribly important, but we have this structure that's actually near the pterygoid muscles of mastication, called the pterygoid canal. There's two other nerves that enter this canal, and those are in red the greater petrosal nerve, and in yellow the deep petrosal nerve. And when they enter the pterygoid canal, they combine into a larger nerve, which is called the Vidian nerve, and that's what traverses through the pterygoid canal. Not super important here. What is important is that the lesser petrosal nerve here also has communication with these two nerves, the greater and deep petrosal nerves, therefore the Vidian nerve. And so there's a little bit of contribution that goes towards the otic ganglion from these two nerves, but the majority of the fibers really originate from the lesser petrosal nerve. But the majority of these fibers originate from the lesser petrosal nerve. Well, the lesser petrosal nerve goes in here and synapses with cell bodies within the otic ganglion. And those axons then project to the parotid gland, and they stimulate the parotid gland to release saliva into the oral cavity for chemical digestion of foods there. Okay? So that's another function of the glossopharyngeal nerve, is control of the parotid gland and controlling the saliva production. The last pathway we're going to look at is a series of afferent nerve fibers, here in gold, that are relaying sensory information back to the medulla oblongata via the solitary nucleus. Now, we've already seen this nucleus before in this video, and it was for special sensation, the first one we talked about. So special sensation as in taste reception by the tongue. We talked about the posterior 1/3 of the tongue is glossopharyngeal nerve. And also the circumvallate or vallate papillae, fungiform papillae, regardless of where they are on the tongue. Taste receptors found in those relay information back to the solitary nucleus. So that was special sensation. Now we're going to see general visceral sensation and also general somatic sensation or somatosensation. The first one we'll look at is over here in the pharynx. Now remember, there's three regions of the pharynx. Up here is the nasopharynx, in green is oropharynx, and down here in gold is laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is sensed via afferent fibers from the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. But here for glossopharyngeal nerve, this relays sensory information from the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. Again, we can follow those afferent fibers. They ultimately come back up here through the inferior ganglion, superior ganglion, back to the jugular foramen and to the solitary nucleus. Now over here, there's a sinus nerve or a sinus branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. This one actually has some shared function with the sinus nerve or sinus branch of the vagus nerve. We remember that for the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, if you've seen that video, there's also a sinus nerve that goes to this bifurcation of the common carotid artery. So right here we have the common carotid artery. It bifurcates into the larger internal carotid artery and the smaller external carotid artery. Now, right at the carotid bifurcation, right here where my mouse is, there are what we call carotid bodies. And these carotid bodies contain chemoreceptors that help to monitor the pH of the blood. These are your peripheral chemoreceptors. And so they tell the brain when the blood gets too acidic or when it gets too alkaline. And so we see that those chemoreceptors, that sensation is relayed back to the solitary nucleus through this pathway via the sinus branch. But also the glossopharyngeal nerve here through the sinus branch is going to innervate the carotid sinus. Now, as opposed to the carotid bodies, which contain chemoreceptors, the carotid sinus contains baroreceptors. And so that sensation regarding blood pressure is also relayed back to the solitary nucleus via this sinus nerve. Earlier we talked about special sensation on the tongue. Well, we also have to relay general sensation back to the solitary nucleus. And just like the solitary nucleus through the glossopharyngeal nerve receives special sensation from the posterior 1/3, We also get general sensation from the posterior 1/3. But there's also some other structures whose general sensation is relayed back to the solitary nucleus via cranial nerve 9. And that is the soft palate. With these tonsils, we have some epithelial tissue that is associated with those, like the lingual tonsils, palatine tonsils. That epithelial tissue is innervated by these branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Also, the tissue of the uvula, and we already mentioned the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And all these structures, their sensation is relayed back, again through this branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve, through the inferior ganglion, superior ganglion, up through the jugular foramen, and ultimately back to the solitary nucleus. So that's the glossopharyngeal nerve. In the next video, we're going to talk about the vagus nerve, and don't be surprised if we see some more of these nuclei repeated. In particular, nucleus ambiguus and the solitary nucleus. We'll be seeing those again actually several times. So make sure to join us then in the next video for cranial nerve 10. Thanks for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, and check out my Instagram for cool science and not science stuff.